Hello, my name is Jeanne Dubino. I am a professor of English and Global Studies at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, which is about 6 to 8 hours away from Washington, D.C. I spent part of fall 2019 at Ain Shams University, and I'm very pleased to be giving this presentation today. The title of my presentation is Virginia Woolf as a Model Researcher. Why Virginia Woolf? You will find out. She was a British novelist, journalist, essayist, feminist speaker, and a model researcher. She lived from 1882 through 1941. And so what I'm going to talk about today is why she is such a model researcher. So here you can see a photograph of her taken when she was around 45 years old, around 1927. So I'm going to base this paper on A Room of One's Own, and you can see this quotation here indicates what kind of book this book is. This quotation reads, "This essay is based upon two papers read to the Art Society at Newnham and the OTA at Girton in October 1928. And these are two women's colleges at Cambridge University in Britain. The papers," she writes, "were too long to be read in full and have since been altered and expanded." So a year later, Woolf published these talks as a long extended essay, and it's about, I don't know, depending on the edition, somewhere under or just over 100 pages. In this book, Woolf transforms her own experience into a fictionalized version, which is somewhat attached to reality, but you can also see flights of fancy in it. So the speaker, or Woolf, you might say, she starts the book off with a research question, and that is an integral part of research. What is your question? What do you want to find out? And so this line here that I have quoted from the book is the first one of A Room of One's Own. But, you may say, we asked you to speak about women and fiction. What has that got to do with A Room of One's Own? And so we see here that the main idea is the connection between women and fiction and A Room of One's Own. But note here that Woolf is addressing the audience. The you is us. The you is you, it's me, it's everyone who reads this book. And you can see that this first question is an answer to a question. All right, we asked you to speak about women in fiction. And so this reminds us that research is in response to a need, and we will talk about that. And then the but. Woolf has a lot of buts. It's kind of a twist and turn. Why are you talking about this? You can almost anticipate the pre-questions. So then research projects, whatever they are, whether they are in social science or literature or science, they have to have a main idea, a driving idea, a spine. And so Woolf provides this over and over again throughout her book. She says, this is my thesis. I will try to explain the connection between women and fiction and A Room of One's Own. And so the rest of the book goes on to unfold that connection. But we also see the humility behind this quest. All I could do was to offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And so I think that when we embark on our research projects, we realize that we go into this big thing with a certain degree of, wow, this is really big and I am one humble person. And I love the humility here. So in the next 6 chapters, this book consists of basically six themes. She goes on to explain her research process. And I'm just going to briefly summarize each of these 6 chapters. In the first one, she eats a luxurious lunch at Oxbridge, which is the British way of combining Oxford and Cambridge. It's like the equivalent of the Ivy Leagues in the US, like Harvard, Yale, Brown, etc. So she contrasts this luxurious lunch at Oxbridge, which is a man's college, with a plain dinner she eats at Furnham, which is a woman's college. And she goes on to say that, those are the material conditions that make education possible, but then she extrapolates that to research as well. But she describes this in this real flight of fancy as to show, food is really good here and it's not so good there. So the second chapter shows herself researching at the British Library and how difficult it can be when you're faced with so much material. What do you do? The third chapter compares and contrasts the real William Shakespeare, and for those of you who are not in literature, he is Naguib Mahfouz. He is the author of on the British literary scene, and through much of history, he kind of personifies creativity and genius without exception. But what Woolf then posits here, or what she puts forth, or what she imagines, is William Shakespeare's fictional sister, Judith Shakespeare. So here's a woman who has as much talent as he had, and why wasn't she writing? Why is there not a female equivalent to this genius, this male genius? And so we can see that research also involves thinking about counterfactuals. That is, what if there had been a Judith Shakespeare? What would that have made possible? And again, we keep going back to the material conditions that make the creation of art possible. In the fourth chapter, she traces the history of British women's literature and British authors to show the obstacles that they face. And again, those obstacles have a lot to do with the fact that they didn't have material support, and they also did not have the support of the society. And again, I will go into some of this as I'm talking. The fifth chapter takes us back to the present day, where Woolf imagines a story of a contemporary woman author, Mary Carmichael, and the kind of fiction that she would write and that she can write now that it's more possible for her to write. And then finally, in the sixth chapter, she writes the peroration, or the call to ask her audience, and these are all women, she calls on them to write. So anyway, these are the 6 chapters, but I can only take you through a few. So in the first chapter, this is chapter 1, where she is on the grounds of Oxbridge. This is a passage from that chapter. And so it's a long passage, but basically what you have happening here is that the speaker wants to find out for herself if this very famous British essayist, whose name is Charles Lamb, she wants to find out if she wants to test something that he claims. He claims that Lycidas, which is a very famous poem by a very famous 17th century poet, John Milton, she wants to find out if Milton changed a line. So Charles Lamb claims that Milton did not change a line. In fact, you can see in the middle of this passage, to think of Milton changing the words in that poem, that is Lycidas, seemed to him a sort of sacrilege. This led me to remember what I could have Lycidas and to amuse myself with guessing which word it could have been that Milton had altered and why. It then occurred to me that the very manuscript itself, which Lamb had looked at, was only a few hundred yards away, so that one could follow Lamb's footsteps across the quadrangle or a patch of green to that famous library where the treasure is kept. So basically, she wants to see for herself if Milton changed a line. She doesn't just want to believe what Lamb said. She wants to see things for herself. And so getting back to research, we women are told things, but we want to test things for ourselves. We can't just trust what we are told, and Woolf shows that here. But then she goes to the library to see if she can get inside and look at the manuscript, and look what happens. Here I'm going to read directly from the book, and I'm going to read this passage. But here I was actually at the door which leads to the library itself. I must have opened it, for instantly there came out, that is, like a guardian angel, barring the way with a flutter of black gown instead of white wings, think of an angel, a deprecating, that is, patronizing, silvery, think slippery, kindly gentleman, who regretted in a low voice as he waved me back that ladies are only admitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction. So we see that here is a woman trying to find out knowledge for herself, and yet the way is blocked to her, which suggests that we women, when we're doing research, we're often blocked in this patriarchal world. And that comes across as well, not in this slide, but in a later one. But here I want to take us to chapter 2, where the speaker, or Wolf, is at the British Library. So she enters the library, and look at what stands out. We read, "The swing doors swung open, and there one stood under the vast dome, as if one were a thought in the huge bald forehead." So she's in this building, and she feels like she's in the head of a man, that huge bald forehead. One went to the counter. All right, so when you go to the British Library, you go to a counter. One took a slip of paper, one opened the volume of the catalog. Now, of course, we would look at the computer to see what books are there. And the 5 dots here indicate 5 separate minutes of stupefaction, wonder, and bewilderment, which all mean the same thing. Oh my gosh, what do I do? Have you, here she's addressing us directly, any notion of how many books are written about women in the course of 1 year? Have you any notion how many are written by men? Here had I come with a notebook and a pencil, proposing to spend a morning reading, supposing that at the end of the morning I should have transferred the truth to my notebook. But I should need to be a herd of elephants, I thought, and a wilderness of spiders to cope with all of this. And so here she reminds us that, whoa, it's a big world out there. I have my research, I have my thesis, I have my topic. I want to find something out for myself. I go to the library, and here I have so much information with which I must contend. And this reminds us of just the enormity of the projects, the enormity of the information that we have to wade through. And then as she finally gets her book, she's basically, you write a slip of paper, you present it at the counter to the librarian, and you tell them which table you're sitting at. You sit at the table, you wait, and the books are brought to you. So in this section here, the books have been brought to her, and now she's reading them. And so she stops for a bit, and look at what she's doing. She's doodling. So then she kind of describes here, she offers a kind of analogy, an extended metaphor of what it's like to research in a world where men do not think very well of women. And here's what we see. "But while I pondered or thought, I had unconsciously in my listlessness or boredom, in my desperation, been drawing a picture where I should, like my neighbor," and she's sitting next to an undergraduate who seems to just be marshaling or filing away the facts. "I should have been like him, writing a conclusion. But what's she doing instead? I had been drawing a face, a figure. It was the face and the figure of Professor von X, engaged in writing his monumental work entitled The Mental, Moral, and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex. He was not in my picture a man attractive to women. He was heavily built. He had a great jowl. To balance that, he had very small eyes. He was very red in the face. His expression suggested that he was laboring under some emotion that made him jab his pen on the paper as if he were killing some noxious or toxic or annoying insect as he wrote. But even that when he had killed it, that did not satisfy him. He must go on killing it. And even so, we see some anger and irritation remained." So we can see here this picture of a man who does not like women, and he's the one writing the books who tell us about, the position of women in the world. And so you can see the kind of hatred and the disdain that men have for women, and so you can see and feel what it's like to try to function in this kind of world, that women don't just face material obstacles, but they also face psychological obstacles. But we can see here that Professor Von X has psychological obstacles too. He obviously has issues with women. But then she emerges from the British Library, and she emerges into the world outside there, and we get a different kind of scene. And I think, once again, it's worthwhile looking at Virginia Woolf's own words. All right. And so let's see what she says here. In my little street, however, domesticity prevailed. The nursemaid was wheeling the perambulator, or the stroll in which there is a baby, carefully in and out back to nursery tea. So it's late afternoon. It's around 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the British drink their tea, eat their tea. The coal heaver, coal was the primary fuel back in 1928, was folding his empty sacks on top of each other. And then we see that the speaker, Virginia Woolf, imagines what the world will be like in 100 years. That is, the world we're living in now. In 100 years, women will have ceased to be the protected sex. And notice that I highlight protected sex here. What does that mean? What does it mean to be the protected sex? It means not being able to do things because supposedly you are too fragile, and it's up to men to be the protectors. But what Woolf is imagining here is a world in which women don't need protectors. They can do just what men do. And look at what she envisions. What does this mean for women? Logically, she says, they will take part in all the activities and exertions that were once denied them. The nursemaid will heave coal, that is, lift these coal bags. Women will be strong and physical. The shopwoman will drive an engine. All assumptions founded on the facts observed when women were the protected sex will have disappeared, as, for example, that women and clergymen and gardeners live longer than other people. Remove that protection, expose them to the same exertions and activities, make them sailors and soldiers and engine drivers. Anything may happen when womanhood has ceased to be the protected occupation, I thought, as I was opening the door. But what bearing does this have upon the subject of my paper, Women in Fiction? I asked, going indoors. And so here she says, engage, keep your focus in mind. What does this scene have to do with women and writing fiction? All right. So she's reminding the reader that sometimes you can kind of go off in these other directions, but you kind of have to keep your eye on your thesis. All right. Or, as I will again say later, keep your eyes on the prize. And so what this has to do, and we'll see in the next slide, it has to do with the fact that when women are writing, they should envision a world in which men and women can work alongside together, in which occupations are not divided according to gender, when women and men can work side by side. And she also, and remember this thesis is about women writing fiction, what are the topics that they should write about? And for us as researchers, what research subjects matter? And so here I'm going to read this passage. She says this at the end of the book. Above all, she says, you must illumine your own soul with its profundities, that is, its depths and its shallows, its surfaces and its vanities and its generosities, and say what your beauty means to you or your plainness. Look at this, you. And what is our relation to the, and now she moves to us, to the ever-changing and turning world of gloves and shoes and stuffs, swaying up and down among the faint scents that come through chemist bottles down arcades of dress material over a floor of pseudo marble or fake. For in imagination I had gone into a shop, and there is the girl behind the counter too. I would as soon have her true history as the 150th life of Napoleon, the great general of France, who pretty almost conquered, or for a short time conquered, much of Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, Or the 70th study of Keats, and Keats was a very famous early 19th century British poet, and his use of Miltonic inversion, which is a poetic device developed by the poet John Milton, while Professor Z and his like are now indicting. So, in layperson's words, basically here we have Woolf, or the speaker of a room of one's own, calling on her audience, whom she's talking to, saying, write about your own soul and your experiences, and write also about the girl behind the counter too. Write about ordinary people. Write about things that are part of ordinary life. And if we're going to extrapolate this and talk about research, write about things that count among ordinary people, such as stores, all right, such as women's experiences. Write about these things. Write about women shopping. These are important experiences too. So this part here reminds us to choose our research topics that are relevant and that are important. Don't just walk over tried and true ground. Forge your own ground. And then finally, she says, this is the final line of this 6-chapter long essay. She says, your research, your work, your writing is worthwhile. And we read final sentence of the book, but I maintain, all right, I am convinced that she, and here she's saying Judith Shakespeare, would come if we worked for her, and that so to work, even in poverty and obscurity, is worthwhile. And so if we want to create great art, we have to work in poverty and obscurity, and it's hard, all right? It's hard work to do this. The kind of research that we're doing is difficult, but we have to remember that it is worthwhile, and you have to constantly encourage yourself. And I think that's such an important part of research, especially when we are embarking on big research projects. So, in conclusion, summing up, when we are researching, Virginia Woolf tells us, we need a research question, all right? What is your question? We need a thesis, and we need to maintain and adhere to that thesis. We come into our work with humility, which is not a difficult thing for us women to do. I came across this term of what's called nego feminism, and nego means to negotiate and to negate. We women are used to doing that in a patriarchal world, but let's use this as a strength for us. Let's embark upon these projects with humility. Let's believe in our own vision. That's important, and that's hard to do. But be ready and to face obstacles, and be ready to feel overwhelmed by too much knowledge. Keep in mind that we women still inhabit a patriarchal world, and we do what we can. We make do. Keep our eyes on the prize, even if it feels like we're getting off track. Choose relevant and meaningful subjects, all right, like the shopkeeper and like ourselves, and stay strong. I remember that when I was at Ein Shams and I was speaking to a class, one student asked me, she said, what is your impression of women in Egypt? And I said, well, my impression of women in Egypt is that they are strong, and everyone clapped, and you are strong. And so I think that we women have to stay strong. And keep in mind that your work is worthwhile, your research is worthwhile, and Virginia Woolf would be the first person to tell you that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. I wish I could be with you in person, but I hope to one day. Bye. Take care. Bye.